I sent my boss a brutally honest text at 11:42 p.m., which is to say I hit send on the exact message I'd been composing in my head for 3 weeks while trying to pretend I was being professional. It was the kind of text that unclenches your jaw and lets all the resentments tumble out, short, sharp, and a little embarrassingly theatrical. I called her cold, accused her of making the whole office feel like a tug-of-war we were all losing, and in the grand finale of late-night rage, told her she was the reason I'd stopped pretending I didn't spend all my commute dreaming about her. It was messy. It was honest. It was absolutely the worst possible idea. Then, like a bad rom-com curse, I realized 2 things at almost the same time. First, my phone had auto-corrected you to Diana at the top of the message instead of you to the friend I was trying to vent to. Second, my phone buzzed with a reply almost immediately. Her name lit up my screen, Diana Martinez. The preview said, 7 a.m. conference room. Bring your phone. If you've ever had that kind of cold, electric panic, where every part of you knows you're about to be fired or humiliated or both, you know the sensation. My legs moved before my brain caught up. I slept maybe an hour, which is to say my mind rehearsed humiliation on a loop until daylight made resignation inevitable. By 7:01 a.m., I was standing outside the glass conference room watching my reflection look like someone who had been photographed mid-crime. Rain had turned the city into the kind of gray that made everyone look like a character in a noir graphic novel. I told myself 100 things. Apologize, own it, don't cry. And then the door opened, and Diana walked in like she owned the weather. She was exactly as she always was in the office. Immaculate blazer, hair pulled back with a surgical sort of precision, the kind of shoes that sounded like authority when they tapped on tile. But up close, closer than I'd ever been without my chest doing gymnastics, her makeup was softer, and there was a tiredness at the corner of her eyes that didn't make her less formidable, just more human. That almost made it worse. She set my phone on the table between us and said, without looking at me, "Read it." Way back in my brain, a ridiculous movie version of the scene unfurled. Me picking up my phone, reading the text aloud, the world gasping. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do around her. Deflect. I started, then remembered that reading the text out loud would make whatever excuse I had evaporate. So I read it. Hearing my own words in the silence of the conference room was like watching footage of a crime you committed against yourself. Every insult landed harder than I expected. When I finished, Diana folded her hands and said, "That was honest." "You could say brutal," I offered, which was probably not the thing to say. Her mouth softened in a way I didn't expect. "You're not the first person to tell me I'm cold," she said. "I would be lying if I said I didn't sometimes want that distance. It's safer." There was a beat where I realized she wasn't asking me. She was telling me about her own survival strategy. She explained that in leadership, especially in a team of people she had to be responsible for, she'd learned to keep things strictly professional. Walls built from efficiency and calendar blocks, because feelings complicate spreadsheets and decisions. She said it like a lesson, like instruction you could memorize. And somewhere in the middle of that matter-of-fact roll call of management rules, she said, casually, "But I knew you were interested." Heat flushed through me. "You knew?" I asked, because a big part of me wanted to demand proof, and another part wanted to die, and a third part wanted to ask what she'd done about it. She shrugged a little. "You wore the look, the same way you fold your hair when you're nervous." She mimed the tiny throat scratch I do when I'm about to say something stupid. "So, I tried to be blunt, because I thought it would help." "That's why you've been harsher than the rest of them," I said. "You've been—" I flailed for the right phrasing and landed on distant. It was a small word with big consequences. "You weren't just being a boss, you were making a line." Diana looked at me for a long minute. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She offered me a choice. I remember the words themselves because they sounded like someone sliding a problem across a board and saying, "Here, your move." She said, "You can take this to HR, file a complaint, and there will be formal steps. There might be consequences. There might be an investigation. Or we can try something different. Temporary, non-work related. I'm going to ask you to be my personal assistant outside of work hours for 3 months. It will be on paper, a private contract. It will not change your official role here. It's," she paused, "a way for us to have a boundary while working through this." There was a lot in that sentence to unspool. In theory, it sounded like she was trying to give me agency, an option that didn't immediately involve HR and the whole mess of being both the complainant and a subordinate in a public process. In practice, the or loomed like a cliff. HR, I knew, could be a relief or a wrecking ball. The alternative she pitched, this improvised contract, was, to put it mildly, ethically tangled. "You're serious?" I asked. "I'm serious," she said, "and I understand if you think this is inappropriate. I know how this looks. That's why it's transparent. Signed, dated document, a witness from legal if you want one. But it will be for outside hours, compensated, temporary." My brain filed the words and dutifully added them to a list titled, "Reasons This is Problematic." A non-exhaustive sample: power imbalance, optics, coercion by virtue of employer control, potential for favoritism, potential for manipulation. The list, in the split second between hearing and thinking, felt like a rope I was supposed to climb. There was another list, too, the one that lived in the precarious corners of my life. Rent due in 2 weeks, freelance work that paid in one-off checks, student loans that didn't understand my emotional breakdowns, and Sophie, the person who had already convinced me that crying was a public service. The practical list nudged hard. "Why would you even suggest that?" I asked, because I needed to hear the part of the sentence that absolved her of malice. "Why not? Just HR." "Because I don't want you to be punished for my inability to handle being human," Diana said, quietly. "And because I want to give you a choice that isn't just suffer through an investigation or leave. I don't want you to be the collateral damage of my mistake." There it was, the admission that this was her mistake. It wasn't framed as a flippant shrug. She was owning the fact she had engineered distance out of fear. Her voice was controlled as she said it, but there was a crack in the tone that made it impossible to ignore the human cost of her choices. "I don't get to make this okay by offering an option," she continued. "I know it's messy. I know I'm asking a lot. If this feels like pressure, say no." Saying no felt like a moral clarity I could admire in theory. In practice, my body wanted food, rent, and the alarmingly mundane comforts of survival. Saying yes felt like being shoved into a corner and told to smile. I thought about Sophie's laugh when I told her how invested she was in the marketing campaign for our client. She'd die laughing at the cosmic irony. I thought about my 9 p.m. habit of making a ramen dinner and then scrolling job listings until I fell asleep. I thought about dignity and pragmatism in the same breath and decided I was good at rationalizing for survival. "I can't promise I won't resent you for making me choose," I said. "But I can't afford to lose my job right now." Diana nodded like she expected no less. "Then sign the contract. 3 months, outside hours, paid. Whatever legal needs to happen, I'll authorize it. There will be a clause that you can terminate at any time, and we revert to HR process immediately. The legal speak, the clause about termination, the detail on payment. These were the thin threads that made the option look less like a leash and more like a bruise you could bandage." She slid a sheet across the table. The page was formal enough to make my stomach flip. Her name at the top, my name under it. Phrases like temporary personal assistant services, before and after standard working hours, compensation at market rate, termination by either party. At the bottom, there was a line for a signature. I sat there with a pen heavy in my hand. weighty with all the ways one decision could ripple through the rest of my life. I hesitated, because hesitation felt like righteousness. And then I signed. After I signed, I walked out of the conference room feeling like a character from a bad courtroom drama, one who had accepted a plea deal for reasons I couldn't fully justify. I called Sophie immediately. The call was a lifeline to the world where my mistakes were punchlines. "You did not," she said, voice crackling with the kind of disbelief that only a best friend can pull off. "Madison Brooks, you actually signed a contract to be your boss's personal assistant outside work hours. This is a sitcom premise. How much coffee are they paying you? Did they offer hazard pay for emotional labor?" "Not funny," I said, but I laughed because panic becomes a joke when you share it. "I signed because rent, because HR would have been a nightmare, and because she said she'd authorized legal to make it legit." "Obviously you need to sleep," Sophie said. "Also, you need a better housing plan." "And also," I said softer, "I think she's messier than I thought." Sophie made the exact sound of someone filing away a new, important fact. "Messy how?" "She apologized," I said. "And not in the way execs do where they say mistakes were made, and then schedule a training module. She actually said she'd been trying to create distance because she thought it was safer. She said she panicked. She owned it." Sophie was quiet for a beat, and I knew she was doing the math in her head. The person I hated. Diana. The person who's been oddly attentive. Diana. The person who might actually be vulnerable. Diana. Sophie was never one for subtlety. "Okay," she said finally. "So either you have a harrowing recent memoir to write, or you're about to star in some very complicated office-based rom-com. Please promise me one thing. No resort romps. No secret beaches." "I promise," I said, and lied already because the universe was apparently auditioning. What followed was a month of weird proximity. The contract was real enough to be legitimized. Diana had a legal counsel draft, a payment schedule, and an actual assistant-level spreadsheet for me to manage. The job description read like someone had mashed together errand coordinator and human buffer, dry cleaning pickups, grocery stops, schedule wrangling, and being present for certain social obligations she didn't want to attend alone. All of these were explicitly outside office hours. We never met in my cubicle for this work. If we bumped into each other at lunch, we stayed strictly professional. That was the rule, and both of us followed it, which made the times we didn't even more conspicuous. At first, our interactions felt like rehearsals for a life we did not yet have. I would text her a grocery list, and she would reply with an emoji I'd never seen her use at the office. I learned the brand of coffee she liked, that she hated cilantro but loved green apples, that her apartment had a ridiculous number of succulents she insisted were low maintenance, and were, in fact, thriving. I discovered she did her own laundry on Sunday mornings, humming under her breath like someone trying to anchor herself to normalcy. She had a stash of battered paperbacks in a basket by her couch, titles I would not have guessed, and a framed photo of a woman, older, with a stern mouth and kind eyes, who, Diana told me one night, was her grandmother. Her voice changed in that sentence, and the wall she wore at the office did not appear in the change. "Why do you make such a fortress at work?" I asked her the first time we had dinner at her place. A terrible pasta she insisted she could make in under 15 minutes. She could. The table was small. The light made her skin look warmer than it did under fluorescence. She was leaning back, rumpled blazer off, hair loose. It was a small injury to my assumptions. She chewed slowly, considering the question like it deserved an honest answer. "Because if I let myself be unarmored, I lose something I need to protect my team," she said. "I'm in a role where people expect decisions and clarity. The moment I show doubt, they look for a replacement. So I preemptively hide. It's cowardly and practical both. I realize that now." The admission landed like a stone in a pond, ripples outward, unmistakable. After that, the armor thinned in ways that made me both protective and suspicious. She told me about her grandmother's insistence that family come first, about being the oldest child, and how that had turned into a habit of caretaking, about a childhood town where accents were louder and expectations heavier. She told me about the way someone had once said she moved like she was made of glass and decided to make herself harder than glass to survive. I started to see the tensions that had been friction at the office, the way she could be ruthless in meetings and then tender in a text, the way her laugh in private didn't match the clipped efficiency of her calendar invites. I saw the person who'd lost sleep over a family dinner because her grandmother had asked if she was seeing someone and expected a traditional answer. It was absurd. Two people in a 21st century city performing old-school familial scripts. But it was also human. There was a night, about 2 weeks into our arrangement, when we were supposed to return a bunch of ill-fitting suits to a boutique, and the air in the car between us had been noisy with silence. It was raining, and the wipers beat a steady, boring tempo. I was driving because she insisted she needed to be off phones for an interview early the next day. We sat in the car in the parking lot and did the thing people do when they've run out of small talk. We let the silence stretch. She turned to me and said quietly, "I'm sorry." "For what?" I asked, because the shadow of the contract made apologies complicated. "For handling it like I did," she said. "For creating distance instead of clarity. For making you choose. For making you sign something that could look like leverage." She folded her hands in her lap, like a child asking for forgiveness. I panicked. I thought if I pushed you away, nothing messy would happen. That was a stupid way to be. I'm sorry. There was an honesty in that apology that had no PR flack in it. She wasn't excusing herself. She was admitting the emotional calculus she'd performed, the fear that had made her construct an armory and then fire it at people she was afraid of getting close to. After that night, something shifted. Not a great romantic reveal, but an incline. The errands we ran together became less like work and more like ordinary scaffolding. We learned each other's small rituals. She insisted I try her grandmother's tamale recipe. I criticized her sock collection. She told me about a scar on her wrist from when she was a kid and tried to build a bookshelf wrong. I told her about economics classes that felt like punishments, and a night I'd gotten caught in a thunderstorm and decided to kiss a cute stranger to feel alive. It was a bad idea. He had terrible breath. It was in these small, human moments that the tension between power and desire did most of its work. The contract had begun as a shield for both of us, and gradually became a frame that made our private disagreements legible. She would apologize when she misstepped. I would point out when something felt like pressure. We negotiated boundaries like two people assembling furniture without the instruction manual. Trial and error and a few curse words. There were external opinions, of course. Office gossip is a force of nature. Someone in marketing noticed I had fewer after-work drinks. A teammate asked if I'd taken a sick day at the oddest hour. Rumors, as rumors do, started as whispers and grew horns. Diana handled it with a strange grace. She never publicly announced anything. But when a senior partner hinted at awkwardness, she redirected the conversation deftly. She also, privately, told me she would be going to HR, within a reasonable time frame, to formalize a transfer for me if I wanted it. It was a sentence wrapped in procedure and good intentions. Again, a recognition that the alternative arrangement was ethically fraught, and that institutional correction might be necessary if we were to continue. "I don't want this to be an open secret forever," she said once, when we were returning a bag of shoes. "I want you to have a career, not a love story or a scandal." The way she said career felt like a plea. I told her then that I believed her, but that I wanted to see action, not just promises. She nodded. That exchange felt like a promise too. Not a romantic pact, but an adult one made of paperwork and accountability. And then, as if the universe enjoyed a plot twist, her mother called. Diana's voice shifted the instant she answered, warmer and sharper, a dialect that smoothed her edges and made her laugh into full sentences. Her mother asked if Diana was bringing a friend to a family dinner on Saturday. A beat passed where I considered ducking behind the car seat like a teenager avoiding a familial interrogation. Diana hesitated, then said, "Actually, I thought I might bring someone." Her mother's voice lit up. "Good. The family will love that. You can't keep avoiding things forever." There was a silence after the call. Diana looked at me with a half smile. "My grandmother keeps asking me if I'm seeing anyone." I told her I had a busy schedule, but that makes her more insistent. "I need to present someone, or she'll send me a pamphlet on funerals for single people." I laughed, the kind that produced a cupful of sound and then made me feel slightly guilty for laughing at her worry. "So you want me to be your, date? For the family?" She shrugged, the motion surprisingly casual. "It's only for a dinner. My family is very old school and my grandmother is persuasive. I thought, if this is temporary anyway, maybe you'd consider being my +1. Fake dating can be discreet. We rehearse, we go, we leave. No one at the company needs to know." The sentence landed with the weight of possibility. On the one hand, the thought of impersonating someone's girlfriend felt performative and a little manipulative. On the other hand, the idea of stepping into her family's living room and telling a woman with a stern mouth that we were together felt strangely intimate. I would be sitting in the row where the architecture of her childhood made sense, a witness to whatever family expectations shaped the person who hired me. "Isn't that complicated?" I asked. "Yes," she said, which might be the point. And there it was. The invitation into a deeper kind of proximity than groceries and dry cleaning could afford. It felt like escalation. It felt like an audition for something I did not yet understand. It felt like the moment in movies where the two leads realize that pretending has the unfortunate tendency of turning real. That night, back in my small apartment, I found the contract folded in the drawer, where I kept my minimum viable wardrobe and a stack of unpaid bills. It was still there, a little absurd in its physicality, the thing that started the whole maze. I smoothed it flat and read the clause about termination again, as if there was some magic hidden in the legal phrasing that would make everything less morally gray. There wasn't. I texted Diana a simple answer. I would come to the family dinner. She replied almost immediately. "Great. We'll rehearse." And then, in a message that felt like both a comfort and a warning, she added, "We do this only if it feels right for both of us. If you're uncomfortable at any point, we stop." I slept terribly that night, because commitments in my life had started to feel like complicated promises. By morning, when the sun dragged itself over the buildings and my phone buzzed with a reminder about the dry cleaning pickup, I realized I had no idea which of the two stories about Diana was true. The ice queen of quarterly reports, or the woman who hummed while doing laundry and feared her grandmother's questions. Maybe both. Maybe neither. On the way to work, as I navigated the river of people pushing through the rain, I practiced what I would say to Sophie, what I would say to my coworkers, what I would say to myself. I practiced boundaries and courage, and the kind of sentences people use when they are trying to be honest and not ruin things. The truth, as it often does, sat somewhere in the middle of all those rehearsals. I had made a terrible, blundering choice by texting my boss what I did. She had made a terrible, defensive choice in how she handled it. And between the two of us, in the messy space of human beings trying not to hurt each other, something had started to form that might turn into a disaster or might turn into a possibility. I unlocked the office door, took a breath, the air conditioning smelling faintly like coffee and printer toner, and opened the door to whatever would come next. The contract, the grocery lists, the rehearsals for a family dinner that wasn't mine, they all felt like a threshold. I stepped through it knowing I wouldn't be the same on the other side. Quick thing before I get too deep, if you've ever sent a text to the wrong person, please drop a comment. Misery loves company, and I need the validation that misery is, in fact, communal. Also, if you like these messy first-hand confessions, consider subscribing. Okay, back to the chaos. We rehearsed like we were preparing for a play that neither of us had ever auditioned for. Diana was meticulous. She made lists, annotated potential questions her mother might ask, and insisted we work on our timeline so neither of us tripped over an anniversary or a made-up restaurant name. I, of course, treated it like a performance piece I'd half-baked during a lunch break and then panicked about at night. "Your answers need to be concise," she said the first time we rehearsed in her living room. "Grandma asks follow-ups if she smells uncertainty. Keep it warm, not intimate. No history. We're at the getting to know part of our relationship, not the tell me everything chapter." "Got it. Warm, not intimate," I repeated, which mostly translated to, "Do not reveal you once considered writing a strongly worded letter to your boss that you accidentally sent to your boss." Sophie became my stylist cheerleader overnight. She arrived at my apartment with a bag of clothes and an expression that said she found the entire situation simultaneously horrifying and delicious. "We need something that says, approachable, not apathetic. Interesting, not trying too hard," she declared, which is to say she wanted me to look like a livable human who had graduated from both thrift stores and 3 fashion blogs. The dress she picked for me was diplomatic, navy, understated, with sleeves long enough to hide my perpetual nervous arm scratching. Diana, unsurprisingly, wore something that fit like armor that had learned to be softer. The two of us standing in my living room before the car ride felt like a photograph from 2 different decades. One of us in tentative 1990s office wear, the other in a tailored current business uniform. Somehow, that mismatch felt honest. We rehearsed the timeline. When we met, a mutual friend, though we would later refine that story to a networking event. The fact that I liked running, true. The day Diana made me laugh in a department meeting, somewhat exaggerated, and the reason we weren't public at work. Privacy for both of us. True, but bureaucratically motivated as well. We practiced smile angles. We practiced small talk that sounded like interest and not psychoanalysis. "We'll get through it," Diana said quietly, when I told her I was terrified of her grandmother, who had the ability to look at you as if she were calculating the moral fiber of your entire lineage by the cut of your sleeve. "If anything goes sideways, I'll step in. This is family. They don't do modern nuance, but they do understand decency." The family dinner was in a house fragrant with something slow-cooked, garlic, cumin, the kind of aromas that told you a meal had been made by someone who believed in feeding people properly. Diana's mother opened the door as if she'd been waiting for a party to begin. Her handshake was warm, her laugh loud, and there was an energy in the room that made you feel like you'd been missing an ingredient in your life. Her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, was smaller than I'd expected, with eyes that were sharp and skeptical in a way that somehow made everyone else shrink or stand straighter. She smelled faintly of lavender and hair oil. When she reached out and squeezed my hand, it felt like a test I did not know how to pass. "You look well," she said in English, then switched to Spanish with Diana, which invited me into a place of partial eavesdropping. Everyone was kind in that no-puppy way families of origin have, immediate, a little intrusive, and grasping at every chance to make you feel included. We performed our stilted romance like 2 actors who'd seen the script the night before. Dinners, laughs, the carefully calibrated nudge of a hand on the small of a back. I watched Diana across the table, watched the way her face softened when she laughed, watched how she let someone else reach for the last piece of bread without an internal ledger flipping. When Abuela Rosa asked if Diana had someone to call when she was sick, Diana's hand found mine under the table, a discreet squeeze that felt like a private punctuation mark. Performing affection is strange because it asks you to pretend at vulnerability, until, if you're not careful, that pretending starts to rearrange what you actually feel. There was a moment after dessert when Diana's cousin told a story about a childhood scandal and everyone laughed so loud the house itself seemed to inhale. Diana turned to me, maybe because the light hit her profile in a certain way, and said, soft enough for only me to hear, "You okay?" There was an honesty in that question that didn't feel performed. My chest buzzed, a mix of adrenaline and an unfamiliar tenderness that didn't care about timelines or contracts. "I'm good," I lied in the kind of way that made my voice thin. I knew the lie was temporary, and the feeling under it was not. Outside, after the night had wound down and the cousins had retired to some corner of the house to gossip, Diana walked me to her car. The street smelled like wet leaves and cigarette smoke, like the city finally exhaling. She stopped, turned to me, and the facade of our evening slipped for a moment, in the way that theater curtains sometimes do between acts. "I know this started terribly," she said, hands in her pockets like a teenager, "and I know you signed that contract because you felt you had to. I'm not asking you to justify that to me. I just..." "Don't," I said. "Don't make me do the whole vulnerability thing right now. I'm tired and I smell like brisket, and I have rent due." She laughed, and it was unexpected. Not a professional, disembodied sound, but a real laugh that didn't hide anything. "Fair." Then she did something we would both later describe as stupid and honest. She kissed me. It wasn't cinematic. There were no fireworks or orchestral swells. It was wet and warm and familiar in a way that made me feel suddenly young and terrified, and like I'd been rescued from a sinking boat by someone with perfectly calibrated hands. We stopped. We both took a breath. We did the small adult thing and assessed the situation like it was a risk assessment meeting. "We need to be sure this is consent," Diana said, which is to say she used a sentence that could have been on a company compliance slide and made it feel like a tender necessity. "Not just because of the contract or the power thing. I mean, are you okay with me kissing you?" I almost laughed at the irony. "Yes," I said, "I'm okay with that." "And afterward?" she asked, because we were living in the territory where the ethics had to be negotiated out loud. "And afterward," I said, because I could feel the terrain changing under my feet. "We make a plan. We tell HR. We sign whatever paperwork helps make this less of a mess." She nodded. "If anything feels like pressure, we stop. I'm not going to use my position." The sentence was simple and enormous. It was a promise formed in the same breath as a confession. Consent given and received. We let the rest of what happened happen like two consenting adults who were aware of the stakes. There was tenderness, laughter, fumbling, and the kind of mutual care that felt both improvised and intentional. It was not a falling headfirst into some fairy tale free of consequences. It was a measured step that we both agreed to take. Afterwards, as we lay on her couch in the afterglow, the city muffled through the window, we talked. We talked about boundaries, about what transparency would look like, about timelines for HR, and what the 3-month contract actually implied now that outside hours meant something different. The morning after, over coffee that neither of us drank properly because our thoughts were tangling, Diana pulled out her phone and said, "I'm going to HR today." I felt something like release and an edge of guilt. "Today?" I asked. "Today." Her tone had the same controlled gravity she used in meetings, but there was softness underneath. "I called Lydia last night to set an appointment. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing. I will request a transfer for you. I will put it in writing that I have acknowledged the power imbalance and want it corrected." She walked into HR like a witness making a statement, which is to say she did it with intention and the recognition that there were consequences. And she didn't ask me to be the one to push it forward. I appreciated that. She took responsibility in a way that felt like a small ethical revolution. She apologized again, publicly and privately, and she made good on the thing that mattered the most: structural correction. Lydia Chen, HR director, practical saint, probably made of a kind of steel that was polished with empathy, walked us through a process that was more sophisticated than people imagine. There were forms, meetings, and an explicit acknowledgement that a consensual relationship did not relieve the company of its duty to ensure fairness. Diana wrote an email acknowledging that the initial contract was an improvised attempt to address a human problem in an unwise way, and requested a transfer for me to a different team to eliminate direct reporting. Lydia nodded and asked relevant questions, including whether the transfer was voluntary. It was. Whether I wanted a promotion or lateral move. I wanted opportunity, not pity. And what timeline I thought was reasonable. The sooner the better. Lydia set things in motion with a kind of bureaucratic decisiveness that felt like actual progress. There would be a transition period so that projects could be handed over cleanly. There would be a meeting with the new supervisor, Marcus, who was to oversee the product team. There would be a note placed in my HR file that recorded the voluntariness of the transfer and the company's obligations to prevent conflicts of interest. The paperwork took a few weeks, but it was an honest process. Diana gave up things too. She proposed to her manager a reallocation of responsibilities so that she and I would not be entangled professionally while this relationship was new. At work, gossip did what gossip always does. It found oxygen. Colleagues noticed lunches moved, saw the two of us exit the same side of the building sometimes, and filled in the blanks with their own cinematic narratives. I tried to keep my head down and do my job, but people are observant enough that if you're trying not to be seen, you're often seen even more. A few dry office jokes were launched at marketing meetings. A couple of supportive teammates offered smiles that read like shields. Diana handled the whispers the way she handled most things, with redirection and a refusal to let rumor be the final arbiter of either our professional capabilities or our humanity. My transfer to product was framed as a promotion possibility rather than a consolation move because that's how I wanted it to be seen. Not a woman being moved out because of scandal, but a professional who had gained new skills and could offer them to a new team. Marcus, my new supervisor, was annoyingly competent and kind in a way that made it impossible to be dramatic about his niceness. He asked hard questions about my workload, advocated for a fair title, and listened when I said I didn't want my new role to be defined by my personal life. "This is a skills match," he told me in our first one-on-one. "You've been doing analytical work that should sit with product. We'll make a plan. We'll also respect confidentiality because, frankly, you shouldn't have to field questions about your personal life at work." He meant it. The transition took the heat out of the worry. I kept my same email, but my immediate report changed, my responsibilities shifted, and the thing that had the potential to poison a workplace, the power imbalance, was actively mitigated. We were not erasing the past. We were acknowledging it and adjusting structures so it wouldn't repeat. There were hard conversations in our apartment, too. We negotiated moments of privacy, how to handle meetings where both of us might be present, and ways to be affectionate in public without performing for anyone. We created an agreement that included check-ins, a weekly talk where we evaluated how the relationship felt and whether the professional separations were sufficient. We agreed on a communication protocol for any office rumors. Transparency without oversharing. "You know," Sophie said one night when we told her, "this is insane. But also, you two are weirdly adorable when you try to be normal." "Normal is overrated," Diana said. "And also," Sophie added solemnly, "if anyone at work tries to gaslight you, Madison, I will come in like a hurricane that smells faintly of cold brew and legal consequences." Sophie's support was, as always, loud and heartwarming. She anchored me when the narrative spiraled in my head. What if I'd ruined my career? What if corporate retaliation was real? What if the narrative never left me? Sophie counterbalanced with pragmatism. Update your resume, keep receipts, ask HR to confirm document receipt, breathe. The months that followed were a mix of routine and small, staggering moments. We developed rituals. Saturday mornings were for grocery shopping, where we argued about how many avocados were acceptable. Wednesday nights became clean out the email evenings, where we both pretended to be domestic and instead just voted on which takeout to order. We were awkward and real and sometimes petty. We fought about dishes with the kind of ferocity that suggests love and not passive-aggressive resentment. We made up with sarcastic notes stuck to the fridge. People at work adjusted their perspectives when they saw professionalism and outputs. There was an inevitability to gossip's arc. It burned hot for a while, and then flickered out as people prioritized deadlines over the personal lives of those under them. I found my footing on the product team. Marcus mentored me in ways that were both instructive and kind. 6 months in, I was leading a project that had been languishing in the backlog, a small victory that translated to a bump in title and pay. It wasn't a grand career vindication. Those don't exist in real life. But it felt like a practical affirmation that my work mattered beyond the rumor mill. Diana applied for promotion shortly after that. She had always been ambitious, but there was a new depth to the way she argued for herself, less performative authority and more grounded confidence. Her grandmother, who had once asked after her romantic status like a litmus test of life choices, came to visit and hugged me like I belonged, which in the language of migration and family meant more than any verbal blessing. There were still moments of uncertainty. People made jokes at awkward town hall meetings. A contractor once asked a question in a way that made me feel like my professional worth was a punchline. We navigated those times by doing the adult things we had promised each other. We documented interactions. We asked Lydia to mediate when necessary. And we reminded ourselves that being seen as a couple at work did not invalidate our competence or our right to a life outside of it. The wedding weekend, Diana's cousin's wedding, which had been the initial impetus for the faux boyfriend arc, arrived with all the foggy romance of midsummer, heat that made hair fight with humidity, the faint scent of wildflowers on the church steps, and a playlist that leaned dangerously into emotional ballads. We'd rehearsed the dinner. The wedding felt like the final exam where the lesson plan was, how honest are we prepared to be? In the rehearsal dinner, Diana's grandmother pulled me aside. She looked at me like she was reading me for durability, and then, with a small smile, said in English that her Spanish would come later, "You are good for my Diana." I could have dissolved into a puddle of gratitude then. Instead, I managed a stiff nod and said, "I care about her." At the wedding, we danced in a way that felt both collected and given over. Everyone watched, of course. Photographs captured us leaning into each other, laughing too loud. And for a moment, I forgot the weirdness of how we'd started and felt only the truth of being near someone who made you want to be braver. That night, we booked a room at a small inn instead of going back to Diana's apartment. It felt private and symbolic, an act that acknowledged we were making choices together. We talked long into the dark about what we wanted from each other, both practical and silly things. Diana admitted that she had feared being the person who lost the respect of her team if she showed any kind of softness. I confessed that I had always worried that my life was a series of survival choices that left me hollow. "What if we try to be honest, badly?" she asked at one point. And the phrase, honest, badly, became our motto. It meant telling the truth even when we didn't have tidy sentences for it. It meant acknowledging the mess without pretending it was anything but. We were both clear about consent and boundaries before we slept together that night. The difference being that this time there were no legal addendums between us, only two adults naming their wants and their limits. There was tenderness, and the intimacy that followed was gentle and slow. It felt like two people making a decision in the same room, not as proof of conquest or hiding, but as an expression of affection that had, improbably, grown from a humiliating text and a terrible contract. The morning after, breakfast came with an earnest conversation about timelines and HR. Diana had scheduled a meeting with her manager to ensure that the transfer paperwork would be prioritized. She had also drafted a memo for legal acknowledging the improvised contract and requesting that it be archived in the file as an artifact of a mistake that had been addressed. It felt like a weird little ritual of accountability. We laughed about the absurdity of our lives and then went to work like responsible people. Over the next year, we built something neither of us could have predicted. We moved in together after deciding the commute was a poor argument against domestic bliss. The apartment spanned both our tastes, her succulence and my tendency to own too many mugs. We scheduled weekly check-ins where we talked about boundaries, budgets, and the small pains of life. We introduced each other to our families in ways that were honest and complicated. Diana's mother and grandmother were enthusiastic in the way that makes you feel like you're being adopted mid-adulthood. Professionally, We both found our trajectories adjusted, but intact. I received another promotion 9 months after my transfer. Recognition for a campaign that had boosted metrics and made people at the company smile. Diana earned a leadership role that let her mentor others in the way she wished someone had mentored her when she was climbing. We celebrated with dinner and an argument about whether we should get a toaster that matched our aesthetic. We settled on an ugly but very efficient toaster because compromise is not glamorous, but it works. There were still awkward moments. Once, at an all-hands, someone mentioned office relationships in a tone that carried 1,000 judgments. The hush that followed felt loaded. I felt the old panic tighten, the feeling that a single text could undo everything. Diana took me by the hand in the row and squeezed, a small, visible commitment. After the meeting, she made a brief comment in the meeting debrief that did exactly what needed to be done. She addressed the policy, reiterated their commitment to fairness, and reminded people that humanity at work is messy but manageable. We also preserved the lessons we'd learned about consent and boundaries. If either of us felt uncomfortable, there was a plan. Immediate pause, a daily or weekly check-in, or even a temporary cooling-off period if the optics or the stress demanded it. Our relationship was adult in a way that had to be practiced. Like any skill, it was a thing we were learning, failing at, then trying again. One afternoon, maybe a year into living together, I was cleaning out the drawer where I kept the spare phone charger, a stack of old receipts, and the contract that had started everything. The paper was folded and a little yellowed at the edges. I held it in my hand and thought about how literal that piece of paper had been. A makeshift bridge between catastrophe and the possibility of something real. It was an artifact that carried all the weight of the early mess. I could have thrown it away. I could have shredded it and erased the evidence of how we began. Instead, I put it in a box with other artifacts from our relationship. A ticket stub from a show we'd gone to the week we had our first real fight. We cried and then ate Thai food on the stoop. A Polaroid of us in silly filter sunglasses, and a note Diana had left on my pillow the day she first told HR she'd request my transfer. The box lived on a high shelf, because some reminders are best kept in a place where you can see them but not live in them. The box and the contract inside it became less of a shameful relic and more of a reminder that people make mistakes, that accountability matters, and that love, if it's going to be honest, requires structure as well as feeling. The contract didn't become a romance talisman. It became a lesson plan. It was a physical proof we were not denialists about power. I kept it because it reminded me to be careful, to keep speaking up, and to ensure fairness for others who might be in similar situations. When friends asked how I felt about the whole arc, the stupid text, the contract, the fake dating, the move into an actual relationship, I had a hard time delivering the tidy moral they wanted. I told them the truth, which was messier. I felt grateful and embarrassed and happy and scared, sometimes all within a single workday. I felt loyal to the idea that honesty, even when it arrives late, was still worth practicing. People asked if I regretted sending the text. The answer was complicated. The text was foolish and hurtful and a breach of the professional norm. It could have ruined me. But it was also an unfiltered moment of truth from someone tired of pretending. That truth set off a messy chain of events that required accountability and repair. The fact that we ended up together did not redeem the moment in a moral sense. It simply became part of the story. Diana never tried to rewrite the past. She acknowledged the wrong ways she had handled things, and she worked to correct them. She took responsibility structurally and personally, and in doing so she modeled for me, and for others, that being a leader means owning the ways you fail as much as celebrating the ways you succeed. I learned from her that vulnerability is not weakness, but a strategic and dangerous kind of bravery. We still argued, about dishes, about whether to adopt a dog. We did. Her name is Miso, and she sheds with the unbothered confidence of a very good dog. About who left the lights on. We also celebrated mundane victories that felt enormous after the early months. A project launch that went well, a dinner where neither of us brought work in, a holiday where our families sat together without a single awkward interrogation. If you had asked me at 11:42 p.m., the night I sent the text, which, to be clear, I now refer to as the text, like a black box in my life, if I ever thought it would lead to anything good, I would have said no. And yet, here we were, with a life that was complicated and tender, and painfully, beautifully ours. We knew the narrative would always have a dark corner where the beginning sat, but we had built safeguards around our lives to ensure that the beginning didn't justify ongoing harm. So what did I learn? A few small things that feel enormous when you stack them together. Say what you mean before your phone does it for you. Speak up about power imbalances and demand structural fixes. Don't romanticize coercion. Address it. Keep contracts in drawers if you must, but make sure they are artifacts of a lesson, not a roadmap. And finally, love can be rogue and messy and still true, as long as you do the hard work after the spark. Sometimes, on long subway rides home, I think about that night I hit send. I think about how instant shame is in the age of smartphones, how a single thumb can change the trajectory of your life. And then I look at Diana stretching on the couch, hair mussed, reading some sci-fi novel she insists is quietly brilliant. And I press my forehead to hers and remember that the story didn't end when my phone buzzed. It started a dozen messy chapters later, and we're still writing them. If you stuck with this wild ride, thank you. If you want to hear more stories like this one, awkward beginnings, ethically complicated choices, and human beings trying to do better, subscribe for more. And seriously, comment about your worst text sent to the wrong person story. I need the company.